Tommy's an allegory and represents an awakening, Townshend's own perhaps, and certainly suggests a kind of spiritual muteness. Anyway, let's get into it, shall we? In 1967, Townshend was still reeling from a disturbing psychedelic experience on his flight back from the Monterey Pop Festival, one in which he began to realise that he was more than his physical self. This sparked an amazing journey towards what Meher Baba describes as a God realisation, and this album, of course. The symbol of the shut-in child is a powerful symbol, and it's an analogy for the state of the world, one where the human race is deaf, dumb and blind, a kind of spiritual mutism, if you will. Townshend in 1968 said isolation is the medium for ultimate transcendence. And this leads to Tommy's own God realisation, as he's lifted from this world of darkness. Blindness is a well-furrowed trope in art. When used metaphorically, it becomes a powerful and potent symbol. Gloucester in King Lear, ironically, only sees once he's blind, in the same way that King Lear only understands when he's mad. It is an image imbued with tragedy, of course, and pathos. Deep Purple's When a Blind Man Cries, Love is Indeed Blind, and Blind Faith, and of course the Parable of the Blind by Peter Bruegel the Elder. F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "Show me a hero and I'll write you a story." And the figure of the locked-in little boy in Tommy is a powerful symbol to build a narrative around. The birth of the rock opera is a thorny issue. Of course, Tommy wasn't the first. S.F. Sorrow by the Pretty Things was there before them. However, Townshend insists that they indeed were the architects of this genre.
Was the idea that opera was something that we could play around with. So it might be that a couple of other people had spoken about it, but we nailed it, basically.
And they certainly did nail it, especially with their experiments with those mini operas, Rael and A Quick One While He's Away. Not to mention the unrecorded opera as a tribute to Kit Lambert, Gratus Amatus. About this time you had Mike Worst's excerpts from a teenage opera. The Kinks had put out Arthur in 1969, which they described as a rock opera. And interestingly, The Who, I'm a Boy, was a song that was lifted from a project, kind of a rock opera called Quads, in which parents can choose the sex of their child. The idea, of course, was later scrapped. Nevertheless, it still prods at the idea of parental responsibility and child abandonment, which is a motif in Townshend's writing. Not to mention A Quick One While He's Away being the obvious example here. The poet Philip Larkin said, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do." This is a sentiment I suspect Townshend would have a lot of sympathy for. However, there's no doubt that Tommy is an ambitious work, and one certainly in keeping with the spirit of the 1960s. The musical landscape of the late 60s was an intriguing and experimental topography. The Stones, after their brief dalliance with the vagaries of psychedelia, set out to remould themselves as the best rock act on the live circuit. As Get Your Ya-Ya's Out certainly testifies. The Beatles had effectively become a studio band. Jimi Hendrix had taken the world by storm with his own brand of impressionistic psychedelic blues, and Cream were a real powerhouse, deafening a whole new generation of music fans. But these were Townshend's generation as well. He must have felt that the bar had been definitely raised. Ray Davies was producing some interesting vignettes of characters and sketches of English life. Pete Townshend says that he and Ray Davies had actually introduced the suspended chord into rock music. A suspended chord being a major chord where the minor third or major third is omitted. And Townshend became quite dismissive of the whole Summer of Love thing, later describing the hippie movement as something born out of political confusion, desperation, fantasy and drug-fueled hope. And of course 1967 saw the release of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, which shocked many as the pop world mutated into something else. Pop's raison d'etre had always been to move products, sell fantasies, sweet teen romance in Cohen's expression. Rock brought self-importance to the table, asking to be noticed and discussed on equal terms with the older arts. In his autobiography, Pete Townshend states of the Sgt. Pepper album, "The shockwave it caused challenged all comers. No one believed the Beatles would ever top it, or would even bother to try. For me, Sgt. Pepper and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds redefined music in the 20th century. Atmosphere, essence, shadow and romance were combined in ways that could be discovered again and again. Townshend was frustrated with the lack of success that The Who were having with their singles at this juncture. Those early singles had very much an R&B feel to them. Interestingly, Substitute, the start of Substitute, was actually lifted from a contemporary British single, Where Is My Girl by Rob Storm and the Whispers. I Can See for Miles is a wonderful, wonderful song, and it should have done a lot better for The Who, only reaching, I think, number 10 in the singles chart. Tired of exorcising his inner demons in fiery displays of autodestructive art that was part of The Who's live show, Townshend did say in 1968 that ours is a band with built-in hatred. It is about this time he is introduced to the writings of George Adamski and reading a lot of Hermann Hesse with his themes of spirituality and becoming self-aware. Subsequently, Townshend and Kit Lambert felt that pursuing hit singles was vacuous and futile.
And that's when I wrote Tommy. I thought I need to write something which is bigger than just a single, you know.
They looked for a grander concept of operatic proportions that would be incredible live, but also to counter the trend of bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys producing studio output that was not designed for live performance. I guess The Who wanted the best of both worlds, melding the compositional elements of those bands, yet the rebellion of their stage performance. As Peter Stanfield says in his book, with their amplified assault on what a pop song should sound like and what it might express, The Who played out the roles of delinquent mischief makers and radical aesthetes, practicing an art that was impudent and violent, yet also tenderly disarming. In a 1969 column for the Village Voice, Robert Christgau wrote that, apart from the Mothers of Invention, we were only in it for the money, Tommy's the first successful extended work in rock music. But Townshend's parodic side is far more profound and equivocal than Frank Zappa's. And much of that profundity comes from the symbol of the mute child at the heart of this story. There were some really interesting studies at this time on autism, one suggesting that a child deprived of the sensory world can have some profound epiphanies, namely the book The Empty Fortress, Infantile Autism and the Birth of the Self by Bruno Bettelheim. There was also a lot of research going into deafness and music and its effects on those who couldn't hear. In fact, Tommy originally was supposed to be about a deaf child that responded to the vibrations of the music. But this changes, of course, after Townshend's interview with journalist Nick Cohen, who felt the idea was a tad po-faced. Townshend knew that Cohen was a big fan of pinball and was writing a book about it. Townshend suggests that if his hero was a pinball wizard, would that make it better and inspire his support?
What about if he's a pinball champion? And Nick Cohen goes, Tommy, the pinball champion, deaf, dumb and blind kid, sure plays a mean pinball, giving me the lines for the song. He says, 5 stars and an extra ball.
Townshend, interviewed in 1968, said of the project, "The package, I hope, is going to be called Deaf, Dumb and Blind Boy. It's a story about a kid that's born deaf, dumb and blind and what happens to him throughout his life. What it's really all about is the fact that he's seeing things basically as vibrations, which we translate as music. When you listen to the music, you can actually become aware of the boy and aware of what he's all about, because we are creating him as we play." Not everyone loved the idea, of course. Disc jockey Tony Blackburn considered it to be in poor taste. Tommy was originally going to be called a Deaf, Dumb and Blind Boy, Journey to Space or Amazing Journey, the Brain Opera and the Omnibus. But they liked Tommy, maybe because of the positive connotations in British culture, representing stoicism and sacrifice, the brave Tommy of World War I. But also maybe because the middle letters of Tommy, the Om, is very significant in Dharmic religions. Earlier concept albums often relied on the printed word or the spoken narrative to drive the story along, SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things or Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. But the storytelling in Tommy happens in song. And what is excellent on this album is that blindness is a leitmotif, on an album that's ironically not always clear and easy to see. There is a sense of confusion in terms of what is happening. It can be dense and disorientating, which leans into the theme of the record, as we are immersed in the sensory nebula of Tommy's world. Although not the first rock opera, this became the blueprint for all rock operas and eclipses everything that precedes it. In fact, future rock narratives owe a huge debt to this album, from Genesis' Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Tulls Thick as a Brick, and even Pink Floyd's The Wall. All owe something to Tommy, I feel. Martha Bales wrote that Tommy was considered more authentic precisely because it consists of hard rock, rather than doctored up Mussorgsky, and avoids the typical pseudo-romantic themes of art rock, i.e. fairy tale bliss and apocalyptic angst, in favour of the more up-to-date subject of popular culture itself. The cover was designed by Mike McInerney, who was writing for the International Times, and he designs a cover based on Meher Baba's assertion that life is an illusion within an illusion. He spoke about God playing marbles with the universe, and the whole pinball element certainly echoes that. Townshend said that Tommy wasn't supposed to be a vehicle for the teachings of Meher Baba, but one can certainly detect the influence here. Tommy certainly expresses a spiritual yearning in a post-psychedelic age. The album was released on the 23rd of May 1969, but prior to this it had been performed at Ronnie Scott's jazz club to the assembled press at a punishing volume, it has to be said. Roger Daltrey said of that night, "We had one weekend of student gigs in Scotland before we launched Tommy with a press preview at Ronnie Scott's in Soho. The journalists were all pissed before we got on. They all heckled when Pete introduced it as a story about a boy who witnesses a murder and becomes deaf, dumb and blind. He's later by his uncle and gets turned onto LSD." The Who had been working on Tommy throughout the second half of 1968, recording at IBC Studios on the 19th of September. Kit Lambert took charge of the production with Damon Lyons-Shaw as engineer. I have to admit, I find the production on this album somewhat odd, to be honest with you. It's certainly out of keeping with music that was produced in 1969. Nevertheless, what emerges is an album of contrast, full of light and shade, with enormous power chords ringing out like cathedral bells during the quieter moments. One critic has pointed out that the sheer power and volume contrasts with its more fragile and quieter moments, nevertheless all fitting together perfectly. Keith Moon has said this album is most un-Who-like, and if it was to serve as some sort of cathartic experience for Townshend, it was also a pretty seismic experience for Roger Daltrey, who said that through this album he finds the true voice of The Who, although he did have some reservations about the fact that true voice of The Who was double-tracked for this album. His voice is already quite full and powerful, so it just seems rather unnecessary. One can only assume they were looking to add an ethereal, otherworldly quality to the whole thing. The album reached number 2 in the UK single charts and number 7 in the US in 1969. Some of the material had already been written, of course. Tracks like Sensation was written about a girl Townshend had met on The Who's tour of Australia in early '68. Welcome and I'm Free were about a sense of peace found through meditation, and the teachings of Meher Baba and Sally Simpson was based on an incident at a Doors gig. A cover of Mercy D. Walton's One Room Country Shack was eventually omitted from the final track listing, as Townshend could not figure out where it would fit into the narrative. It's a Boy was derived from Glow Girl, an outtake from the Who Sell Out. The 8-track system which was used for this album allowed for numerous overdubbing and adding lots of extra bits, like John Entwistle's use of the French horn, for example, as well as Townshend's piano parts. The double bass drum kit owned by roadie Tony Haslam was used by Keith Moon, as Premier had refused to give Keith Moon any more drums. I wonder why. If you think about the sequencing of this album, it starts with Overture, where all the musical motifs of this album are squashed into that opening sequence. This, of course, is a traditional opening for an opera, and this segues into the story of Captain Walker. The lyrics say that Tommy will never see his father again, which is quite ironic given his disabilities as a result of the tragic event that he witnesses. The nurse claiming, "It's a boy, Mrs. Walker, it's a boy," has an almost Wagnerian feel to it. 1921 is an interesting number, and it was changed for the movie, of course. 1921 was post-First World War. Ken Russell sets it about 1950. On the album, his father kills his mother's lover. It's the other way round in Ken Russell's film. The intonation of the song convinces us it's going to be a good year. It's almost like the dialogue going on between mother and father as they try to come to terms with the traumatising events of the father killing his mother's lover. Tommy sees the murder as he's looking into the mirror. And the parents are saying, you didn't hear it, you didn't see it.
You didn't hear it, you didn't see it. You won't see nothing, no one ever.
And then you get the fragile voice of the child. I heard it, I saw it. Before he no longer hears or sees anything. And the manifestation of this trauma for Tommy are his senses being shut down. Amazing Journey refers to that quiet vibration which Tommy was supposed to respond to. It's a journey towards God realization or awakening, I think. Sickness will take the mind on an amazing journey where the mind wouldn't ordinarily go. And Meher Baba says in order to find oneself, one has to lose oneself. And of course the song ends with a marching rhythm, emphasising a journey. Sparks, of course, is an instrumental, followed by the cover Eyesight to the Blind, which was an old blues number which had blindness as a motif, and it speaks eloquently of the power that women wield over men. It very much feels like a prelude to the Acid Queen. Christmas, the pathos of this is palpable, emphasising that Tommy cannot share the joys of the season. I mean, what's sadder than a deaf, dumb and blind child on Christmas Day? It's a song heavily infused with religious iconography, allusions to Jesus, who healed the blind, of course, allusions to Tommy being saved. The leitmotif that Daltrey sings here presents the inner voice of Tommy with the see me, touch me refrain. Cousin Kevin leans into the theme of bullying and abuse and was written by John Entwistle at the request of Pete Townshend, who felt the idea, I think, was just too heavy for himself to deal with. With Acid Queen, Townshend called this a misogynistic song about the power women wield over men. She's like a wicked queen. She is an artefact from childhood fairy tales and stories. And we get that sort of post-coital shudder in this song as Tommy's senses are restored as he's given psychedelics and then subsequently seduced. Undertroy is an instrumental which provides a nice breather from the intensity of Cousin Kevin and of course the Acid Queen. It's supposed to be a nice little interlude of colour which perhaps represents Tommy's psychedelic experience. Pinball Wizard was a song sung by someone else observing Tommy as he plays with his universe. Performed beautifully, I think, by Elton John in the Ken Russell movie. Finding a doctor and go to the mirror is a wonderful moving part of this narrative as the song is intertwined with the doctor's voice, and it introduces us to that anthemic prayer, listening to you I get the music. Then we get Smash the Mirror, of course, which immediately reminds us of the child being almost locked into the mirror at the very beginning of the narrative. The mother smashes the mirror and the trauma is broken as he awakens. And the mother smashes the mirror and the trauma is released. An act of violence took away his sight and an act of violence restores it. Sensation is an interesting number. It's a clever pun as it foreshadows his Messiah-like persona. Sensation meaning to feel and sensation to be a sensation. Tommy becomes a superstar and then we get Sally Simpson, of course, which, as I said, was based on an incident at a Doors concert. She is effectively pushed off the stage and is subsequently scarred. It certainly all starts to point to Tommy's misuse of his power and influence. Then we get to examine the whole cult of Tommy with the rather silly holiday camp business. We're not going to take it. We see the crowd turns against Tommy and the cult of Tommy as he encourages a sense of sensory deprivation, which the crowd reject. He's vulnerable once he reaches God realization. He rejects it all and makes a connection with the universe. Rather than a wish, it is now a realization. Tommy's representation of childhood trauma and a kind of a spiritual chicanery is as dazzling as it is at times impenetrable. In the film Almost Famous, it is said, "Listen to Tommy with a candle burning and you will see your entire future." Certainly the whole future of rock was given a vantage point that this band assumed in 1969. The band forsaking the Regency dragon ruffles of their 1967-68 stage costumes, and following the commercial and critical success of Tommy, Townshend donned a white boiler suit and Doc Martens, even as Daltrey was in the process of turning himself into a rock god. The guitarist's new attire suggested a rejection of such pop pomposity and a realignment. When Jeff Beck attacked his amplifier and smashed his guitar in Blow Up, it was in response to the instrument's malfunctioning. When Townshend rammed his guitar into his speaker stack, it was done with the aim to create noise. The Who existed in that contradiction that George Melly described as revolt into style. And Tommy, despite its rather odd production, rather clumsy conjunctive plotting, is still a very important piece for this band, even though the songs sometimes function merely as devices to advance a rather sketchy plot to begin with, one that Daltrey has certainly criticised over the years.
The thing about the original record is it's so full of holes, it's not a story at all.
Nevertheless, this is such an important album in terms of the rock canon of the 1960s, and serves as a line in the sand, I think, for this band. Certainly bridging those kind of early singles and the much more serious thematic work they would go on to do in the 1970s. Anyway, you've been watching a review by Classic Album Review. If you've enjoyed this, please do click like, subscribe and check that notification bell. Check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at the channel. It's always much appreciated. And other than that, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.